Greetings, this is Charles Darwin, and I'm speaking to you from a forest near Tulsa, Oklahoma. And you can see I'm up to my neck in plants of all different kinds. This is a very complex ecosystem that I'm in right now. And what I wanted to think about with you is how would you study this kind of complex ecosystem with all these species of plants, lots of species of animals too, much more than we can see. I hear some birds. There are some insects around here also, and the soil is filled with thousands of species of microbes. How do you study something that complicated? And a lot of times, to understand a complex system, we have to create a simplified model of reality. And frequently, that's what experiments do. So, for instance, you could do experiments with one species at a time to understand how that species reacts to different conditions of light and moisture. For instance, this columbine right here. Or you could then, in order to study species interactions, you might have just two species in your experiment to see how they affect one another. Perhaps the columbine, and this is a hackberry seedling right here growing out of the rock. I don't know that anyone's ever studied those two species and how they interact with one another, but an experiment would allow you to do that, to create a simplified model of reality. I want to tell you about a very interesting experiment that was published in the journal Science in a recent year. And in this experiment, some ecologists wanted to understand a complex system, the prairie ecosystem. In particular, they wanted to understand the interactions among grasses, grasshoppers, and spiders, and the decomposers. That's 4 levels going on right there. How do you understand something that complicated? Well, you break it down into its parts. Of course, the grasshoppers eat the grass, the spiders eat the grasshoppers, and whenever any of them die, or when any of them defecate, it goes into the soil and the decomposers eat it. Now, it's important to understand these interactions because when the grasshoppers process the grass into feces, the feces decomposes in the soil differently than the way just dead grass would. And so they wanted to understand the effects of grasshopper droppings on decomposition rate in the soil. It turns out that the decomposition rate of the grasshopper feces depends upon the relative amounts of carbon and nitrogen. If the feces has more nitrogen in it, the decomposers will metabolize it faster. And so it also turns out that when grasshoppers are experiencing stress, that they produce feces with relatively more carbon and less nitrogen. Therefore, how the grasshoppers are physiologically reacting to their surroundings, whether they're experiencing stress or not, is going to affect the entire food chain. Well, how do you study something that complicated? For one thing, is it just the stress of the presence of the spiders, or is it actually the spiders eating the grasshoppers that affects this food chain? Well, some experimenters wanted to know, so they created 2 model systems that were alike in almost every way except one. In one system they had spiders, grasshoppers, and grass and soil. And then the other one they had the same thing. Grasshoppers, spiders, grass, soil. But in this case, the spiders had their mouth parts glued shut. Therefore, the only difference was between these 2 treatments was were the spiders able to actually eat the grasshoppers, or were they just able to frighten them? And it turns out that simply frightening the grasshoppers caused the relative amounts of carbon and nitrogen to change in their feces, and therefore had an effect on decomposition rate. See, now we have a better understanding of what was going on in that system just through one simple and very ingenious experiment. Well, this tells us something about science. Science studies complex systems, but in order to do so, it has to create simplified models of reality. Science is like a yoke, sort of like yoke of oxen. That's a wren right now that we're here. It's like a yoke of oxen. The yoke restricts the movement of the oxen. They can't just go off in any direction they want to. Science is like a yoke. We can't just go off and think anything we want to think. We have to use the scientific method. But this yoke will allow the oxen to pull the cart of knowledge forward through the mud of human confusion. And I think that is what makes science so uniquely effective compared to many other systems of thought. Well, think about that. This is Charles Darwin. Tally ho, and amen.